Good afternoon. I will now call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development to order. My name is Caitlin Cleveland. I'm the MLA for Cam Lake and chair of this committee. The NWT Legislative Assembly Standing Committee on Social Development is made up of regular members who can look deeper into social issues affecting NWT residents. The Standing Committee on Social Development is currently conducting a 5-year review of Child and Family Services Act and to its related resources available to NWT residents. The committee wishes to acknowledge that certain topics are of a sensitive nature and may be triggering for some individuals. Should you become uncomfortable or experience any mental distress, please contact a healthcare provider in your community right away. Our first order of business is to open our meeting with a prayer, and I will ask MLA O'Reilly to offer prayer with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you wish to experience peace, provide peace for another. If you wish to know you are safe, cause another to know that they are safe. If you wish to understand seemingly incomprehensible things, help another to understand. If you wish to heal your own sadness or anger, seek to heal the sadness or anger of another. Dalai Lama.
Thank you very much, MLA O'Reilly. Our next item is to review and adopt the agenda. Mr. Burla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have first on the agenda is a presentation related to the Child and Family Services Review from Dr. Pertice Moffat and Ms. Heather Fikowski, who are affiliated with the Aurora Research Institute. And we have a small amendment to the public agenda. Unfortunately, the 4B Housing Review presentation is cancelled this afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very much, Mr. Burla. Are there any further changes or amendments that members would like to see to today's agenda? Seeing or hearing none, can I have somebody move the agenda as amended? Thank you, MLA Knockleby. MLA Knockleby has moved the agenda, and the agenda is in order. Having reviewed and adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest today? Hearing and seeing none, today committee will hear a presentation for the Child and Family Services Review from researchers affiliated with the Aurora Research Institute. We have before committee today Dr. Pertice Moffat, instructor, BSN and Research Support, Education and Training and Research Divisions, Aurora College, and Ms. Heather Fikowski, oncology medical social worker for cancer care for the GNWT. So I'd like to take this moment to welcome both of them and thank them very much for their time today. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels, and presentation materials will be available on the Legislative Assembly's website after the meeting has concluded today. To respect physical distancing requirements, all witnesses will be attending by video conference. And I would like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions, and remarks will need to be directed through myself as chair. Both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking, and I'm now going to ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with MLA Knockleby.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Rocky Simpson, MLA Hay River South.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Thank you very much, members. At this point, I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Moffat to introduce herself, and then after that, straight away to Ms. Fikowski to introduce herself and to please provide introductions. And after that, I'd like to invite you both to go straight into your presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us to this important meeting. We are honored to be here today on Chief Dryke's territory, home to Yellowknife's Dene First Nation and Métis people, and acknowledge with humility that we are settlers to the north, but consider ourselves allies for good health and well-being of all Indigenous peoples. We recognize and are appalled by the historical trauma suffered by local people from past and ongoing colonial and racist practices that unfortunately exist systemically. Our words come from respect, authentic relationship, and in a spirit of reconciliation. Today we wish to talk about children and family needs what is working well, and ways to improve. In consideration of this Child and Family Services review, we respectfully offer our learnings from findings and evidence from research studies done here in the North. My name is Dr. Purtis Moffat. I have been a health and social scientist in the NWT for over a decade. Many of those years were focused on a SSHRC-funded and 6-year intimate partner violence study, followed by a study of emergency protection orders that evolved from the original study and was funded by the RCMP Domestic Violence Fund and housed in the YWCA. More recently, I have been working with a national team led by Doctors Peter Jaffe and Myrna Dawson on the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative with Vulnerable Populations. And I am a panelist on the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Accountability and Social Justice. Ms. Sandy Little is a social worker, educator, and research team member with us on the completed scoping review and community engagement studies. She could not be here today, but contributed a great deal to our presentation. So I guess I should ask now that Ms. Fikowski be introduced.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moffat. We really appreciate you being here today, and we really look forward to hearing from you, given your vast experience working in the Northwest Territories. Ms. Fikowski, we would love to pass the floor over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thanks so much for creating some space to hear our thoughts and the findings around some preventative approaches that can support children and families in the Northwest Territories. My name is Heather Fikowski. I am a white settler from Alberta and have been fortunate enough to live here in the Territories for the last 19 years with my family. Currently, I'm a research associate with the Aurora Research Institute and a social worker that's practiced here as a clinician, an educator, and a researcher. I was co-investigator with Dr. Moffat on 3 studies that she had mentioned. So the SSHRC project on intimate partner violence, the emergency protection orders study, and the most recent studies we completed with the scoping review and the community engagement project, all of which we'll be referencing this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. I'd like to pass the floor back over to yourself, Dr. Moffat, to start your presentation. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to briefly provide an outline of what will come. So we will address briefly children and family needs, what is working well, and we'll then spend the most of the presentation on improvements in 4 areas: education and awareness at the community level and for professionals, cultural integration and community healing, clinical and justice responses, and policy and legislation. We will provide concluding thoughts and then entertain questions from the committee members. Next slide, please. The needs for children and families can be traced back to many intersecting factors, which we have highlighted on this slide. Poverty has led to families' needs for universal basic income, university quality child care, and food security. There is not enough housing, and many houses are in disrepair, along with homelessness, which is both visible and hidden. Families need safe, stable, and affordable housing and transitional housing. Traumas comprise of different terms and different ways to explain how things have happened in the past and are still showing up today. Collective trauma occurs with Indigenous peoples universally impacted and continue to be impacted in an ongoing way. Families need healing. Systemic racism is real. Families need socially just and culturally safe services, policies, and legislation. Intimate partner violence continues to be high, with families requiring safety and nonviolence. Next slide, please. Integrated case management is bridging the gap between departments who are caring for clients with complexities and puts the client at the center rather than the system. Indigenous peoples across the North are sharing their knowledge about the healing power of the land. A community member told us in our 2020 community engagement study, just like that, he felt good about himself, you know. He felt he was worth something instead of how he felt during drinking. The land takes away all his stuff that is in him. You go and sit there in peace, you feel it. The Arctic Indigenous Wellness Camp is providing such a welcoming space where one can access elders, the land, the fire, a cup of tea, be accepted and present. The Healthy Families program is providing opportunities to learn about family wellness. As well, the YWCA's Child Recovery, Girls Space and Dudes Club is beneficial to families. We know that Rock Hill Apartments is no longer present, but the housing model was an exemplar for families in transition, providing them shelter, security, and safety. And finally, community interagency meetings are a place to come together and discuss local initiatives that are created, designed, implemented, and evaluated at the local level. Next slide, please. The notion of dream big came from an elder in a community focus group in 2020 to help break the cycle of family violence for future generations, where they included being guided by elders, engaging the community, being on the land, and harnessing the strength of women. To discuss planning for future generations in the center of this diagram, there is an opportunity to break the cycle. For example, a community member from the 2020 study shared these words: "Sometimes it's our upbringing, small, if our parents drank, and if we see the violence, and so we go out not liking what we see. On the other hand, we could say, oh, my mom did this, and or else my dad, so he could beat her, so I could do the same thing. Or it could be the other way around. So we could talk about it." Keeping with that theme of dreaming big and planning for future generations, we are integrating in this presentation the findings from the IPV study published in 2017, the scoping review in 2019, and the community engagement report in 2020. The colored circles around the outside of the diagram identify the organization of this presentation to you. We are framing the improvements under education and awareness, cultural integration and community healing, clinical responses, justice responses, and policy changes. Next slide, please. There are improvements needed at the community level. One major theme from our 2017 study was that people are shutting up about the violence. Sub-themes that contribute to this social response to violence include the normalization of violence, both within the communities and across our frontline workers. Another contributing factor and sub-theme is community gossip that is used as a tool to silence women. And a third sub-theme is community retribution for women and families who speak out about violence or access support. In 2019, from focus group research in the North, Build Community Cohesion is recommended to communities to come together to develop solutions to reduce and end violence, recognizing that each community is unique. This is similar to the community approach described by researchers in one study in our scoping review, who discovered a pattern of cumulative disadvantage for Indigenous women and girls. Based on their results, they suggest strengthening existing multi-sectoral services in the community and ensuring that community service workers understand the process and complexities of IPV. Similarly, we published a report supporting campaigns here in the NWT that denormalize violence and encourage community members to speak out to end violence. From an Australian study, researchers described implementing the Strong Family Program on reproductive and sexual health education with elders and youth in conversation about healthy relationships, consent, family violence, and alcohol. Their evaluation showed improvements in knowledge and attitudes in the youth. In another systematic review that we included in our scoping review, family-centered interventions, with 6 strategies and enablers to those strategies, as well as measuring health outcomes, were all effective. This design could potentially be used to evaluate effectiveness of NWT early childhood programs. For example, nutritional status, emotional and behavioral health, depression and substance use in parents, health service access, satisfaction, utilization, cost to community cultural revitalization. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, there is a significant evidence in the literature that describes child and youth prevention programs, including the research we conducted from 2011 to 2017. We interviewed over 50 frontline workers in the NWT who described how best to move towards a nonviolent territory. There is a need to target younger children and youth prevention programs with information about healthy relationships, emotional self-regulation, and coping strategies to address stress. This was voiced in our study in 2017 when an RCMP officer said, "Start with the young people in a stronger way and building up that strong confidence in the youth. Give these young women the tools that they need so that they can know that whatever violence happened in their family as they grew up, it isn't the norm and shouldn't happen to them." Primary prevention to reduce gender-based violence aimed to change knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors with targeted population groups like adolescents and young adults. Topics highlighted are consent, bystander roles, healthy relationships, understanding oppression, structural violence, and social actions to address this violence. There is a need for early identification and supporting at-risk youth for dating violence. A systematic review of 104 peer-reviewed articles and 40 websites demonstrated several effective child-focused prevention and education strategies, including 3 adolescent school-based prevention programs, 4th R, which is a program about healthy relationships, Safe Dates, which focuses on healthy dating, Shifting Boundaries, which is a program in middle schools to reduce violence in dating and sexual harassment, a boys' school-based prevention program called Wise Guys 2, and 2 adolescents at-risk school-based programs, Expect, Respect, and Youth Relationships Program. Next slide, please. Education and awareness is needed for professionals providing services in the communities. Many studies identify the impacts of colonization, historical oppression, and ongoing marginalization that are the root cause of the violence that is occurring. A community health nurse suggested, "I think it's misunderstood by the service providers in that if you don't understand the cycle of violence, it is very hard to stay non-judgmental when you're dealing with the victim and the perpetrators. Even within frontline workers that participated in our 2017 study, only 1 participant specifically noted the impacts of their work, whether it was compassion fatigue or effects of vicarious trauma, but every one of them recanted stories or impacts that indicated the emotional toll of the work that they are engaged in. Most of our study participants spoke to the stark differences in the frequency and lethality of violence when compared to other jurisdictions they have previously worked in. They acknowledge that the shock wears off with time and that they become desensitized to it. An education focus is needed that improves professionals' breadth of knowledge about theories to explain family violence and use of interventions to better detect and effectively respond to risk and family violence. Education would specifically help improve knowledge about IPV, risk for domestic homicide, and child exposure. Education that is culturally competent and reinforces trauma-informed approaches is vital. Improved IPV knowledge leads to better detection and more effective support to women and children with nurses, social workers, counselors, physicians, and police officers. Next slide, please. Education will create a paradigm shift from blaming mothers to realizing that mothering is present and heightened for women and children experiencing intimate partner violence. For example, a healthcare worker stated, "It just seems so wrought with traumatic experience, and these experiences almost seem like not the norm, but kind of the norm." A study with abused mothers identified that mothers engage in protective factors to keep their children safe. When creating safety plans with women, it is important to include their protection plans within the safety plan. Mothers are creative with protecting in the moment, based on the context and their children's responses to what is going on. They also provide emotional support in response to what is happening in their lives and attempt to mitigate the situation. Indigenous mothers find that cultural teachings of nonviolence and ways of being help them with mothering and their children and creating their plans. There is an extended family role for caring for children, and this is very important to our population. Enhanced safety planning with the help of the extended family is vital in remote communities. It is important for professionals to include the question to abused mothers: "Tell me about how you protect your children." This acknowledges their mothering and helps them with creating their safety plans. Next slide, please. Our territory has active and engaged elders, and this active role for elders is important. As noted by a community member, it is an honor to be in the presence of elders, sharing their wisdom. And I think it would be great for the youth, and take that knowledge, that wisdom, that experience. It is also good for healing. We all experience things different, but the experience the elders bring in and how the youth will take it and make it their own. Elders facilitate and co-facilitate prevention and intervention programs. As noted in the literature, this role is measurably more effective when incorporated into prevention and intervention programs when it is community-based using traditional and spiritual practices. Traditional Indigenous values, spirituality, ceremonies, and elders will help men redefine themselves. Sobriety is also needed to reduce violence. From Australian studies, men's healing requires contextual understanding of inherited grief, loss of traditional roles and culture, dispossession of land, economic exclusion, and poverty. Next slide, please. Integrating elder women is a means of supporting women. For example, cultural interventions to treat addictions in Indigenous populations is recommended from a study called Honoring Our Strengths, Indigenous Culture as Intervention in Addiction Treatment. They identify some important guiding principles. For example, we are all in this together. Each person brings a part of the whole. Communicate and promote self-determination in the design and delivery of addictions and mental health by and for First Nations, Métis, and Inuvialuit people. Holistic research, being open to unexpected outcomes, maintain momentum, keeping relationships over time for the treatment of clients. We need to give the best of the best. Two-Eyed Seeing respects and integrates the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and Western sciences, often weaving back and forth between the two worldviews. Reconnecting youth with their culture fosters self-esteem and identity, and elders are their teachers. Next slide, please, and Ms. Fikowski will present the next set of slides.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski.
Thank you. The next major section of recommended improvements is specific to clinical responses that are preventative approaches to current or future violence within families. First, I'll speak to a trauma-informed approach to practice. As service providers and policymakers, we need to acknowledge the interpersonal and structural violence that has historically taken place and that continues to exist for Indigenous Northerners. It includes understanding how history, structures and practices, and even current structures and practices are racist experiences which impacts their health and wellness, and that this impact becomes greater the longer it is experienced. Practitioners can create a safe space for people when approaching their practice from this trauma-informed, strengths-based lens. While they can't fix the larger systemic experiences, they can acknowledge their existence. We can help people feel safe and respected in just about any circumstance. And by being respectful and included, people can feel more comfortable and confident in accessing services to support their needs. We can offer the best services, but if people aren't feeling comfortable, confident, or culturally safe within those services and with the service providers, it's not going to be of any benefit to them, and it might even do some harm. The next major point on this slide speaks to multidisciplinary teams. The use of these teams in practice has shown to make significant difference in people's use of mental health services, increase the response from child and family services and healthcare services. In a study in our scoping review, it noted the effectiveness of co-locating mental health services within a child and family services agency. This arrangement of services demonstrated ongoing and timely communication between the two divisions. It improved collaboration, cooperation, and decision-making that came from stronger interpersonal relationships. These relationships developed a better understanding, a better respect, and trust in each other's professional knowledge and roles. There was also a shared sense of responsibility, which is so incredibly important to highlight here, as it helps all departments recognize and feel the weight of responsibility to the welfare of children and families that too often and easily falls under the umbrella of child and family services. Next slide, please. Can you advance the slide, please? With regards to routine and repeated screening, many studies indicated that detection rates and interventions are increased when routine and repeated intimate partner violence screening instruments are used across a diversity of settings and with all women, including adolescent girls, during prenatal screening. One report included in our scoping review identified 10 particular screening tools for use in healthcare settings, and of those, the abuse assessment screen, the woman abuse screening tool, and the HARC questions had demonstrated validity, with the HARC questions showing the most reliability and validity. Research also talked about an inconsistent uptake and use of screening tools with healthcare providers once these were implemented within their workplace. For example, one study found that between 60 and 91% of workers were not completing the screens. For successful and effective screening, frontline workers need education and support in place before this rollout. This systematic protocol for screening could include such things as who completes the screens, how frequently they should be happening, and that frontline workers are given really specific therapeutic responses, actions, and resources that are immediately available to them should a woman disclose. Providing opportunities to disclose with the use of screening instruments helps that conversation with women and mothers, and with that, preventative interventions to support the welfare of children. While tools can introduce the opportunity for disclosure, there's some key strategies that can help women support a woman's disclosure of violence, as this can be or is sometimes the most dangerous and risky of steps to take in terms of her safety and that of her children. This next bullet on the slide highlights some of the strategies. One study found that having a consistent provider who was able to successfully develop a sense of trust over time improved disclosure rates. This was also highlighted in 2 of our community focus groups when women were specifically asked about the use of a screening tool during well women visits. Women in these focus groups also highlighted the importance of having effective, immediate services response and resources to support her needs and those of her family if she does choose to disclose. Next slide, please. This slide is speaking to assessment tools, and the first bullet highlights tools that women can use when they're experiencing violence. Women are more likely to underestimate risk, and this can be for a number of possible reasons, one of which includes the impacts to her mental health, which can diminish her decision-making capacity. The use of assessment tools to help them identify risk may be of benefit in preventing children's exposure to or risk of violence. One study included in our scoping review used randomized control trials to measure the effectiveness of an interactive web-based decision-making tool called iSafe, and it was found that this was an effective intervention at reducing violence experienced by women. It helped them perform self-assessment risks, set priorities to help with decision-making, and created personalized safety plans. The second bullet is talking about risk assessment tools for frontline staff. When we talk about risk assessment, it's necessary to reinforce that decision trees and risk assessment tools used in practice are evidence-based. Evidence-based decision trees include frontline workers that possess a specific knowledge about intimate partner violence, someone who understands the unique northern contextual factors that contribute to protection or risk, and uses decision trees that incorporates the survivor's input. It also includes the most appropriate evidence-based risk assessment tool for their practice setting, the skill of the user, and the intended outcome for that particular assessment. So the risk assessment tool used by the RCMP does not necessarily imply that it's clinically relevant or effective for use with physicians in the ER, community counselors, or child protection workers. Each tool will have a best fit for their setting, their intended use, and skills. However, even with different tools in settings, it's still going to facilitate effective communication between and within departments and with the frontline users to help prevent violence or future violence in homes across our territory. Next slide, please. Several papers spoke to the importance of working from a strengths-based approach which acknowledges mothers' efforts and the strengths when surviving violence and caring for her children. Integrating this approach will improve the mother's sense of self, increases her engagement with her children, and help shift the work from protect the kids to enhancing and supporting the family's overall functioning. The second bullet on this slide is really about prioritizing a mother's mental wellness as an effective intervention for both she and her children. Women who experience violence from their intimate partner are at risk of developing shorter and longer-term mental health effects, irrespective of staying in that violent relationship or leaving. What the research has shown is that mother's mental health is tied to the wellness of her children. One Canadian-developed program that we included in our scoping review is iHeal. It has a group format and is co-facilitated by a nurse and 2 elders. The program's shown significant improvements with women's quality of life, traumatic symptoms, depressive symptoms, her support, and personal agency after having completed the program. Intentional and early interventions from service providers, be that family physicians, shelter workers, victim services workers, or CHINs, interventions that targets a mother's wellness will have direct implications for the child's overall functioning as well. Next slide, please. This continues on with interventions for mothers, and I'm going to begin by talking about a double jeopardy that mothers can experience. Oftentimes, mothers find themselves in a situation where they're confronted with two courses of action, and neither of which is something she'd prefer. We've heard of these experiences from Northern women and families, or Northern women and frontline workers who've participated in our studies. We've also read scholarly papers that reference this double jeopardy as a significant hurdle to accessing support, services, or safety. One study in our scoping review made specific recommendations for establishing clear protocols between health and child protective services that addresses this double bind experience when trying to flee violence while fearing the possible apprehension of their children if they do reach out for that formal support or intervention. Non-abusive parent interventions incorporate positive parenting strategies and promote parenting warmth. These interventions lead to improved wellness for the child. The Mothers Overcoming Violence Through Education and Empowerment program is a 13-week mandated and group format for women that includes a therapeutic group for their children that's run at the same time. And for the wee children that are too young to participate in therapy, they provide childcare so that mothers' participation is encouraged. Results from the MOVE program demonstrates improved self-esteem and help-seeking efforts from moms. It increases parenting knowledge and skills, as well as understanding the impacts of their children being exposed to violence and being better able to support their kids' needs as a result of that exposure. Next slide, please. So this last slide is about clinical responses specific for children. Caring for the mental wellness of children who've been exposed to violence is looking ahead to the intimate relationships in their future and working to prevent violence in their teens and adulthood. Providing therapeutic and long-term support gives children the opportunity to express their feelings about the violence, support the development of their emotional regulation, and better understand healthy relationships. One study spoke to a sleeper effect, which with regards to the impacts of children's exposure to violence. The study was unable to determine if this was a lag in symptomology or if it was with a cumulative effect from being exposed to violence, or if there was a delayed response in terms of what the child was demonstrating. Either way, the recommendation from this longitudinal study and other studies we've included in our review encourages ongoing mental health assessments and therapeutic services for children who've been exposed to violence. Dr. Moffat referenced the development of safety plans earlier in the presentation, and what we've learned is that safety planning is an effective clinical intervention for mothers and children to prevent or lessen the degree of child's exposure to violence. Frontline workers can develop safety plans collaboratively with moms, incorporating her own experience in terms of knowing what will work best to keep her children safe, and then working with the kids to learn, develop, and role-play these plans so that they're equipped with these safe strategies when and if they ever need to use them in their own homes. Next slide, please. So I'll continue on, but this is with justice responses, and that we found that these have implications for children and families with regards to prevention of violence where they may be at risk of exposure. A 10-year-long longitudinal study based out of Calgary looked at the effectiveness of a specialized domestic court and batterer intervention program. Part of what they attributed to the success of this program was the collaborative system approach between the Crown, police, probation services, court case workers, and the community counseling program, all of whom had acquired specialized knowledge about intimate partner violence. It demonstrated reduced recidivism rates from 41% to 8.2%, and it showed significant improvements in men's mental health. The second bullet speaks about emergency protection orders, which are tools currently used by our frontline workers and people across the North who are experiencing violence as a short-term and immediate intervention that removes a violent person from the home and prevents future violent incidents. One study in our scoping review evaluated the effectiveness of EPOs that were obtained by 138 women, and it found that the women were more open to breaches if they remained in their home with the EPO than if they chose to relocate. And that of all women who obtained the EPOs, 96% of them had reported breaches, and only 26% said the abuse had stopped. From that study, it was recommended that women should relocate rather than access an EPO if there are greater risks present and if they are experiencing more severe forms of abuse. It also recommended that breaches be taken seriously, that for women who do remain in the home with an EPO, there needs to be a multi-sectoral response to support their safety with collaborative efforts from housing, income support, and justice. The last bullet is talking about developing a death review committee. Regarding incidents of domestic homicide that occur in the NWT, there is a gap in territorial data reporting that these deaths are not specifically classified as such. These homicides are those that result from intimate partner violence by a current or former partner, and it may also include the death of children. Along with this data reporting method, a death review committee would help to better understand the systemic issues, gaps in service delivery, risk factors, and patterns within these occurrences so as to inform recommendations for preventative and intervention strategies. Next slide, please. So I'll shift over to the policy and legislative improvement suggestions. Speaking back to our study that wrapped up in 2017 with frontline workers, what we heard was that every participant in our study spoke to the high rates of alcohol use and its connection to the high rates, lethality, and frequency of violence across the territories. Unfortunately, national data shows the NWT is having the worst for hospitalizations entirely caused by alcohol when compared to any other jurisdiction in Canada, with high mortality and morbidity rates. There's good evidence that taking a whole-of-government approach to tackle alcohol use will reduce alcohol-related harms and have a direct impact on the wellness of children and families across the North. And let this be a significant preventative strategy to assist the ongoing efforts of Child and Family Services. We're aware of an identified lead within the Department of Health and Social Services that is working on this specifically, and it's really exciting. Including this slide is not to speak to that work, but to reinforce its importance and the importance of having full support and efforts from multiple sectors within the government to achieve its goals. Next slide, please. Many studies highlighted the critical importance of government designing responses in a new, more integrated way. This whole-of-government approach to eliminate family violence has direct implications for better outcomes for children and less involvement with Child and Family Services by reducing violence or mitigating its effects. One major theme that arose from our first study was the siloed practice in regional centers and smaller remote communities all across the North. Frontline workers acknowledged the need to transform their perpetually crisis-oriented response. They suggested coordinated, interdisciplinary, and multi-sectoral responses that more purposely integrates preventative services across all departments. When setting up cross-sectoral agreements, the literature included in our scoping review indicated the need for more formal terms of reference that clearly defines the roles and responsibilities. Both Dr. Moffat and I have spoken to this second bullet. We just wanted to highlight this one last time, this need for shifting the discourse about mothers who are experiencing violence. The literature supports policy recommendations that endorses, encourages, and reinforces a paradigm shift from blaming mothers for being victims of violence and punishing them with the very real threat of removing children in the face of that violence, to seeing their strengths, or to seeing their resistance and the great lengths that they go to protect their kids. The last bullet is about housing. We've spoken to cross-sectoral prevention responses to create nonviolence for our children, and the research indicates affordable housing is an effective strategy to achieve that effort. That for women who are leaving violent relationships, they and their children benefit from safe, secure, and affordable housing. Another important housing program for families is client-centered transitional housing programs that don't have timelines or limits to the length in which they can receive service. The old YWCA Rock Hill apartment building was an effective housing program for families in Yellowknife. It reflected a client-centered approach to secure transitional housing that integrated in-house programming to support families' independence and healing. Next slide, please. Hiring appropriately trained staff who understands unique northern practice dynamics that exist in our communities will help with staff retention, aid in building and maintaining effective community relationships, and with that, encouraging community members' engagement in preventative services and programming, as well as more crisis-oriented services that are available. There's also recommendations to ensure sustainable funding to programs to both governmental and non-governmental services so that, in the words of one of our study participants from 2017, we can actually know if it made a difference. The last point this afternoon is about the organizational level responsibility in addressing compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma experienced by frontline workers. In our current pandemic state, this is a very real threat to the mental wellness of people who are providing care. Governments and organizations will be forced to respond to these threats and demands if that pressure isn't already being felt or responses being implemented. From our 2017 study, Dr. Moffat referenced the predominantly indirect mention from each of our 54 participants about the impacts that violence has had on their wellness. While individuals have a role in identifying and mitigating the impacts of their work in terms of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, there is also a significant role at the organizational level to help prevent and address this cost of caring. Policies or procedures that effectively respond to staff wellness following critical incidents and longer-term organizational strategies that prioritize the mental health of frontline staff will have a positive influence on the services being provided to children and families. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we wanted to highlight that early education and in-school programming targeting children and youth are effective prevention and intervention strategies. That multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary approaches to support children and families is an effective way in which to address violence and prevent future violence, including the co-location of services. Screening, assessment, and intervention strategies should be evidence-based and integrate cultural approaches to healing. Mothers who are thinking about or are taking those courageous steps to access help in their violent relationships are faced with many northern contextual barriers. The fear of judgment or a double jeopardy experience that makes those steps that much more difficult. It is so important that it is kept at the forefront of policymakers and program developers, and with frontline workers who are directly supporting mothers and their families. We also need to remember mother's mental wellness and that providing services to improve her mental health positively impacts the wellness and overall functioning of her children. And lastly, we wanted to stress that our frontline workers, both those who are employed with the government or with non-governmental organizations, are passionate about their work and compassionate toward children and families, but there is a cost to their caring. Supporting their wellness at an organizational level will positively influence the services provided to Northerners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by thanking yourself, Dr. Moffat, and yourself, Ms. Fikowski, for your presentation this afternoon. And right away, I'm going to turn it over to committee members for questions from anybody who'd like to start us off. Emily Knockleby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation. I don't really have a lot of questions, more so just some comments. I thought that it was a really good point about asking mothers what they're doing to protect their children. Some of the education I've been getting as part of this committee has been around basically the catch-22 that you describe of mothers trying to get help, but then once they start getting on the radar of certain governmental groups, it actually works against them. So I just thought that was a really, really good point that you raised, and I liked that the presentation did actually have some things for us to actually do that were measurable instead of just only us talking all the time about the problems, which, you know, we all know are really numerous. So I guess maybe I do have a question a little bit around your death review committee. I know that's I understand the point of what you're saying is to look at sort of the bigger picture of why this person has been in this circumstance. What would you envision that committee being comprised of, or what sort of format would that look like? Thank you.
Thank you very much, MLA Knockleby. Dr. Moffat, would you like to start us off?
Yes. Well, I do work with the Domestic Homicide Initiative, and there are really good examples of death reviews in the larger provinces, in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in fact, I think they are going to have a full workshop on death reviews in the upcoming conference, May the 11th to the 14th. So I would encourage you to come into that conference and listen, because the information that they're learning from these death reviews is very significant in how to advise women who are in a violent relationship and you can see it escalating. And there is concern, and particularly when women say to you, I think he's going to kill me. So I think we don't have a lot of time to go into detail on some of the things that we said, but I just wanted to remind you all that the scoping review that we did actually has outlines of the authors of that we've included, and I think it's a great place to go and actually look at what we've done, because we asked it's a pretty the protocol is very significant to a scoping review. It is a synthesis of the literature, but it follows a very structured process. And I want to tell you that the question that we asked was, in northern remote, primarily Indigenous communities, what are the most effective short and long-term strategies to reduce the incidence and severity of family violence? And of course, within that, we talked about children, we talked about elders, we talked about adults, and we talked about men and women. So it is quite an extensive scoping review that we did. And then we engaged with our communities to ask the communities what they thought about the results of the scoping review. So we hope that this will really help this review as well. You can go in and you can see actually the literature that is related to children and women and overall. I mean, we can't fragment these things, but that's a long-winded answer. Sorry about that.
No apologies required at all, Dr. Moffat. MLA Knockleby?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also give lots of long-winded answers, so no worries there. I guess, and I appreciate that there's a lot here for me to go back and look over and digest, and I'll probably have questions. And I would encourage anytime there are things like these conferences for you to let us know, so that even if one of us can attend or take place, it brings back information to our committee. I guess just a little bit on a side note, I really believe in, or another sort of topic, what you're saying about engaging female Indigenous elders, etc., and relying on their experiences and stuff to help younger people. However, I have to admit that I find even this conversation triggering for my own personal life. So I'm curious to know how then do we help people who are not only, like, we're looking at them to help others, yet this is going to be all very re-triggering and traumatizing for those people themselves. And I'm wondering if at some point we're not just so traumatized as a collective, is that not just putting it back on people to solve a problem that, you know, maybe is not, there's not the capability or capacity for? Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Knockleby.
That is
Dr. Moffat? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That is a very good question, and I don't want to be the only one speaking, so I'm going to hand that over to Ms. Bukowski.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Bukowski?
Thank you for the question. I really appreciate that, actually, because I think, and what we kind of ended on was talking about the impacts of our work. And when we're talking about pulling in Indigenous elders into that, are we then further exposing them to additional trauma? There was a couple specific programs that talked about incorporating Indigenous elder women, and one of them it came out of BC, and it wasn't just that the people that they were including into the program were knowledge about their tradition, their culture, also about intimate partner violence, and they were provided education around that. So they were it was really recognizing kind of more about their knowledge and their experience and their wisdom within the community, as opposed to clinically providing that support. When they were included in this program, and I don't have like a lot of the specifics, but really what they were looking in terms of interventions that the Indigenous elders were providing was looking at kind of providing the groundwork for healing, sharing their wisdom. They used traditional cultural practices, and hoping that might motivate engagement with the participants in the program. So it was they were also provided kind of that I think there was a sense of collegial support as well between the elders and the nurses. They really worked collaboratively, and it was really kind of honoring the expertise that each was bringing to the room to support these moms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fikowski. MLA Semler.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. There's just a few things that I kind of wanted to highlight from your presentation, and the 60 to 90% of frontline workers not completing the screening. And this is, I think, something that we see all the time, and I think that's why we said having permanent staff within these areas, which we know is an issue, and that's why it's one of our mandate, like one of our priorities of this government, is try to find ways to have permanent staff in the health and within social services, because when we have that high turnover of locum staff, they don't know every paperwork, everything that we're doing, so a lot of times things get missed. So I'm glad that was highlighted in here, because that just goes to our other priorities. And the comment that you made that mothering is heightened in an IPV relationship, which and I think that's the thing that we've heard from other presenters that we've listened to and then when we talk about the protection factors, this is where I think this heightened protectant factor goes into play, is when they're in an abusive relationship, they don't want to reach out because that's their protectant factor going on, because if Child and Family Services gets involved, then they may lose their children. That's the stigma, and that is, history, of children being removed, and that's the biggest, I think that's one of the biggest fears as an Indigenous mother, is that any little thing that you do not do according to, the mothering book of whatever's of the time, that your children will be taken away, and so this is where I think my question is how do we, within all the research and everything that you guys have, and I see that we have, talk about elders and cultural healing and all these other things, but and then this is maybe a comment, but maybe just your sense as we keep saying that we can't have Child and Family Service workers be the person that takes them away, but also be the people that are preserving that family structure and supporting that family to not have their children removed. And I just want to hear whoever wants to speak on your thoughts of that.
Thank you very much, MLA Semler. Dr. Moffat.
That is a really good question that you're asking, and I think that there are programs and there are things happening, for example, where you have always a team approach with a police officer, a shelter worker, a victim service worker handling a case together, so you get support in that way. There are sometimes visitations where people, where maybe an elder can go in and with the family and help with some initiatives. But this is a very good question, and one that is being explored in the literature more often now. And I think what I'm going to do is ask Ms. Vikowski to respond to this as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Vikowski?
Thank you, and thank you so much for this question. I think you're really teasing out something that it's a major barrier for moms to reach out for help. So they're not reaching out for that help because they're worried that their children are going to be taken away. And I always think, as a practitioner, I think, we talked about using this strengths-based approach. We talked about using a trauma-informed lens when practicing. And if a woman can come into a conversation with a social worker, with a community health nurse or an RCMP member, whomever it is that they're kind of speaking with, and if they can come into a space that is that feels respected, that feels safe, they don't feel shamed or blamed, even if they're not specifically talking about their violent relationship, but if they can have an encounter with this frontline person that feels safe, and they can build this kind of confidence. It may not be that moment where they disclose that they're in a violent relationship for a wealth of reasons. It just really could be too dangerous at that time. Or maybe they're just kind of feeling it out. But if they can always kind of have that, know that experience was safe and non-judgmental and supportive, they might come back and have a little more sense of trust in terms of being able to reach out for help, and trust that particular person will support them and their kids in the most respectful, inclusive way possible. There was also, in the literature, one of the studies did specifically outline some components of protocols that could help address this particular double jeopardy that women find themselves in. And they talked about addressing the history of colonialism, that the protocols would address the history of colonialism, the marginalization experienced by Indigenous families, intergenerational trauma and its effects, the extra surveillance that Indigenous families experience, establishing clear paths for collaborative information sharing between frontline workers, and including mom's input if Child and Family Services does become involved. So I think it's something that can be formally established. It's a very, very, it would be a very difficult protocol to try and develop, but I think it would be really important to help guide frontline workers, but to not lose sight of the effectiveness of coming from that trauma-informed and strength-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vikowski, and thank you, Dr. Moffat. MLA Semler?
Yeah. And I wanted to, also acknowledge that, to make sure that, somewhere within our legislation, there should be, and like you said, that heightened observation of Indigenous families. Like, I find that, with children that are being taken in care, and I said it in the last review, pretty much 100% of the children in care in the Northwest Territories are Indigenous. We know it's not just happening in Indigenous homes. We know it's happening across the board. And I can speak to my own experience. I was in a home where there was family violence, and maybe because of who my grandmother was, the stature of the family that we had, when I went, I don't ever remember being involved with Child and Family Services, but then I think about, is that, I always kind of take my life experience or lived experiences that or things that people have brought to me as how do we measure this? Because knowing that we've seen mostly Indigenous families, but we know that it's not just happening in Indigenous families, but it seems that they're over surveillance, like it's poverty, it's Indigenous, it's people who are accessing other services, they're being surveillanced a lot more than anyone else. Doesn't mean that their kids are the only ones in the community that are being that. So I wanted to just recognize that, you know, and for the record, that I'm glad that you've said that in this. But to the education part, you know, the one thing that I as my past experience as a school public health nurse, you know, there is a curriculum for children and for teens and for youth, for, you know, within the health system on, you know, interpersonal relationships and all these things. And I'm glad that you've said it in there, but like, we're doing a review for Child and Family Services, but we know that in order to change, we have to educate the youth, educate the children. This means under a different minister, under a different legislation, that this kind of education needs to be in there. And what I've found is that in the education system, if you don't have a teacher, or you're working with a school nurse, or somebody who's comfortable saying these things and within the appropriateness, and you know, and then you have families that don't want their children to learn this, you know. So then there's this barrier that you find with education and educating our children, on our teens. Like, if you don't have a teacher in that school, like if you have a small community and you only have 3 teachers in that community, is one of them going to teach interpersonal family, you know, violent relationships, what's healthy relationships and all these things? No, because they're too busy doing everything else in that school. So these are not, like, you know, do they get bumped off as not priorities in that? And here we have small communities where we're seeing young girls being murdered, you know, in violent relationships. And so I think we need to shift where our priorities are in education if it's survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MLA Semler. Dr. Moffat, did you want to start?
Well, boy, you said so much there. And first of all, I want to say, yes, there is a disproportionate burden of ill health and alignment with Indigenous people. And this whole thing is very complex. And yes, of course, there is violence happening all around the world with all kinds of people, and they're not all Indigenous people. So that's a really important point. To say that. And I also think that education is vital. And, you know, MLA Semler has spoken to the fact that we have a revolving door of practitioners, both in the education department in terms of teachers and in terms of nurses and in the RCMP. They're all coming and going. And this makes it very difficult to have people understand the uniqueness of the populations in the territory and to understand, you know, to even speak the language and to recognize the elders within the community who maybe were the people who addressed adolescent puberty. Like I know, like Rosa Mantla, for example, did a lot of that work in the Cleacher region. Like, why one of the things that I think we need to do is find in a much more participatory manner the community people who can really provide this education. And if they wanted, and this happened in a breastfeeding study that I did, I remember some of the elders said, well, I breastfeed all my children, but you know, it's been a long time and I would like to have some education about it. And then I would like to provide that information, because you know, culture is dynamic, and what happens when you do that two-eyed seeing process within the science and the Indigenous person, then you've got this stronghold, and maybe that is where we need to go. Not even maybe, I think that's where we need to go. permanent community people can provide these services and really I think we can make a change if we go about it in the right manner. And having said all that, perhaps over to Ms. Vikowski to add to that, but I appreciate very much what you're saying.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Vikowski?
Thank you. I think I agree with what Dr. Moffat was just speaking to, and I think I can just add or reinforce one important piece that MLA Semler was making reference to, and that is that this doesn't just have to fall under the Child and Family Services umbrella, that this is also maybe something that goes to a different department, looking at the education like education, culture, and employment. Do they have a role in all of this? And we had talked about looking at cross-sectoral response to the welfare of children and families and moving our territory to one that is nonviolent. And I really believe, and the literature certainly is indicating, that this is the most effective way to address the experiences of violence that children and families are having right now, is to really kind of everyone working together and finding their role in this effort. And so I really appreciated you kind of highlighting the fact that maybe this is something that has to kind of fall under education, because I absolutely do think it does. I think every department has a role to be playing in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fikowski. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions at this time? Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the presentation. Coming from a small community, a relatively small community, I guess, for the North Hay River, I do get a lot of people come through my office with issues related to family violence and children issues as well. And I guess I look at it and I deal with like EPOs and with legislation and that as well. However, I guess I look at this and over the years, I guess I've thought about it. How do we fix it? We talk about it and constantly try to address it, but it never changes. We still have our Indigenous children in care. We still have families torn apart by violence. We still have high rates of addiction. We have, Indigenous people in correctional centers as well. So, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I guess, I know this has to be an integrated approach. We can't find one thing to fix it. And I look at lack of housing, lack of maybe education. I look at addictions. I look at racism. I look at, Indigenous people being devalued. You see that in chances for employment opportunities, and things like that being overlooked. So there's a number of things, and it impacts people. And when you don't have employment, you don't have a house. We have a waiting list here in the territories of, close to 1,000 people or whatever, 1,000 units that we need. So there's a multiple of things. And then we have staff, trying to address the issue, and that staff is probably overworked. They're dealing with they've got to address their liability issues, accountability, their safety when they're going to homes. Then they've got reports to complete. They've got, basic administrative duties, I guess, as well to do. And then they're working within legislation that may be dated, that may be overbearing. I'm not sure, but there's just so many things working against it. And with the staff, I see them being burnt out. The other thing I guess with the staff is that we just don't seem to have enough of them. Like and we're, as a government, I always say we're here to provide a service. And that's the important thing. That's what I'm here for, is to provide a service. If somebody calls me at midnight on Saturday, I have to take that call. That's what we're here for. We can't say that, no, you wait till Monday. when it comes to issues of violence, issues of children getting taken away, it's important we address it. And how do we do that? We have to make sure that we have the staff in place. And, and then again, like with the EPOs, they use them, it's a good tool. The problem is it gets misused. It pits, partners against each other. It causes them to use the children, as a bargaining chip almost. What happens is that, one parent says, well, I'm going to take the children away. The other parent feels that if it's the mother, she doesn't want to see that the children go with, say, the father, because she knows what would happen. So then she breaks the order, she doesn't, and then she gets charged for it. So it's one of those things, and I guess I just see so many issues, and I just don't know where to start. And I guess I'm looking for answers. I know that for myself, I deal with the issues and with people as they come to the office and that, but I know that we have to address this on a bigger scale, and I don't see it getting any better. Maybe I'm wrong, but it has to be an integrated approach. And where do we start? I guess that's my question. Where do we start to make it better? Like, we talk about it, we do studies on it, we do reviews on it, but where do we start to fix it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, MLA Simpson. Dr. Moffat?
Wow, you sure packed an awful lot in there, MLA Simpson. My goodness. Where do we start? Well, first of all, I want to just say one thing. There are some really hopeful and promising practices already in the North that we've said. So not to sound so hopeless. I mean, I recognize there are lots of issues, but I every time I go to an Ekletsa Day at the Hoititsita, I see capacity building. I see elders speaking out. I see people working together, and these things are extremely promising. And yes, there are many issues, but I think we're starting to target them. We have more housing money. We know we need more. We have identified things like the whole government working together, and I honestly do believe that is going to be helpful. We have this committee and this opportunity to actually come here and speak, and I want to say that, our group would be very willing to speak again, even in private or whatever we need, to explore more options. And maybe we need to do this to kind of get things moving and going. And I know that it does feel at times that there is just no change. But I think partially right now, one of the things we have to consider is this pandemic. We are in the pandemic, which we have a shadow pandemic at the same time, which is domestic violence, because of the isolation and, the anxiety and the mental health. So I know this is a lot of talk that I'm saying, but I think we're moving. I think we are moving. It's slowly, but we're moving. And I would just like to ask Ms. Fikowski. I thank you for your question, and ask Ms. Fikowski if she has further comments to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski?
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate all of your comments, MLA Simpson, and everything that you kind of highlighted there in terms of what you found to be a really significant piece with moving forward, or the hopes of moving forward to create nonviolence here. And it feels like it sounded like it was almost a little paralyzing when you kind of lay it all out there. When we consider kind of the overarching systemic issues right through to what trickles down to the front lines, and that those front lines should be operating 24/7 to support people who are experiencing violence or hoping to kind of get themselves out of it. So I think what do I want to say here? I think that, where do we start? I would be a hypocrite if I didn't say, we need to kind of come from this strengths-based approach and follow suit with what Dr. Moffat began with and say, we are not doing everything wrong. There is a lot of wonderful approaches and programs that are happening in our territories, and incredibly strong leaders in each community that are modeling wellness for families. And I also think that women who are in violent relationships and surviving these relationships and protecting their children and going one day at a time are also, so courageous and so strong in terms of how they're forging ahead. I think that to move forward to tackle those systemic issues, we have to do so looking at reconciliation, acknowledging some racist policies, approaches that are happening with Indigenous families, and really trying to break down those barriers and coming together as departments. And even on the front lines, just trying to kind of work together. When we met with all those frontline workers kind of over the course of a few years in between 2010 and 2017, they all were so, they did this off the side of their desk, a lot of them, to meet with us. And it just shows in amongst all of what they're trying to tackle and do, they still carved out this time to sit with us and talk about where do they see us moving forward? How can we kind of address this moving forward? And they really still see hope. They have the energy to share their thoughts and experiences and visions about moving forward. And part of that was about really getting in there and educating our children and youth in schools and outside of that school setting, whether it be kind of those formal education programs or even having on the land programming, getting kids and youth reconnected with their elders, reconnected with their land. Those were kind of pieces that stick out for me. And I think you also mentioned housing, and housing is such a critical piece for women and families right now in our territories. They're living in this crisis, and being able to have a safe, healthy housing environment will allow them to kind of get their feet underneath themselves and look at other services that are available, heal, and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the responses as well. This issue, I guess, when we talk about family and children, it hits home for me, being born and raised and Indigenous to the NWT. We're talking about, some of my family members, and we're talking about my friends, people I grew up with, and people I see every day, in Hay River and some of them on the streets. So it's, it means a lot to me, and trying to, to address this issue. And, when somebody tells you that they want to, that they want to commit suicide, and they can't get, and they can't get hold of anybody, they're put on hold. I don't like hearing that stuff when we're supposed to be providing a service. And, with addictions, somebody wants, they finally, got the sense that they want to change their life and they want that help. They're put on hold. We can't do it right now. Come back in a week or come back in a month. It's those things. Respect is being lost, I think. And, and then in going out on the land, and it's great. I know if I'm out, if I'm outside or something like that, I love it. It's great. Then all of a sudden you come back into an office, or you come back and reality hits you. and you're lost again. So there's all that. I'm not sure if I really have a question in there, but I appreciated the presentation, and it kind of, I guess, hit home a lot of points, a lot of things to think about. And I'd be open to another meeting with you both as well, because I think this is a very, very important issue that has to be dealt with sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Simpson. Dr. Moffat or Ms. Fikowski, would you like to respond?
Yes, I will say I agree with you, and I agree that it's appalling. I remember once being in a small community in the Clicho region, and an elder woman said to me, when someone in my community comes to me and says, and even if they are drunk, I need help. She said they're reaching out for help, but yet they can't leave the community until they're sober. So these cries for help, I agree with you completely. We need to address them. They're vital. If we have a 24/7 call-in line, there has to be somebody at the end of that phone who takes action for people, because it could be life or death. It could be a young person contemplating suicide. And, you're right as well about the staffing, and I sometimes feel myself that the staffing, like for example, we don't have a victim service worker in every community. We know, we've reported on those statistics. So we do have to all put our heads together to come up with what is the best use of funding and our ability to get the correct people to look after people in a culturally responsive and trauma-based way when they're dealing with these awful situations. And we have to be proactive and not reactive. And so often, everything that we're dealing with in the North feels like it's coming from a crisis, a place of crisis, rather than being prepared for it and ready to act on it. And I will invite Ms. Fikowski, please answer as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski?
Thank you. I think this just feels very hopeful for me. In the last 12 years, Dr. Moffat and I have been kind of swimming in all of this and meeting with frontline people, meeting with women, meeting with organizations, and reading a lot of literature. And I think that for me, this feels hopeful. It feels like people are pausing to try and consider the larger systemic barriers and paths forward. And that path maybe is not just each department walking on its own, but maybe looking at how they can come together and walk on the same road. And, and in a way that is really felt at the front line, that the frontline staff feel supported, feel prepared in terms of their knowledge, and also equipped with the supports and the resources to respond to families who are coming forward. I hate hearing that people aren't getting the support they need in the moment that they're asking for it. And sometimes what I wonder is if we don't have the services to kind of help or the support to the front line to kind of to work with them as effectively as I know every frontline worker wants to. That is never lost when we've met with frontline staff. They are working so hard to support people in the North, and it doesn't mean that is successful every time. But I guess what it shows is we're not losing that. Like, that's already there. And so I think from kind of the larger policy level, it's really kind of supporting frontline staff and non-governmental organizations to continue to move forward with people from a real strengths-based and trauma-informed lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. MLA O'Reilly?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I'm going to try to go at what my colleague, Mr. Simpson, said, maybe from a slightly different angle. Look, I'm in a Yellowknife MLA. My background is environmental stuff, so I don't really know a lot about social issues. I continue to learn, and I'm not even on this committee, but I come because I want to learn. I'm kind of overwhelmed with how much information you presented me today, and look, you folks have studied this stuff, and I really appreciate all the effort and work that you've put into this. And I come from a university background myself, so I can appreciate the research. But as a decision maker, a policy maker, a legislator, I got to take this and somehow translate this and work with my colleagues or the colleagues on the committee into some kind of recommendations that are going to go to our colleagues in the House to make improvements to legislation that at the end of the day we hope are going to improve children and families and women. So, and allocate money in perhaps in better fashion and so on. So we have to, I'm mindful of how do we get from where we are to where we need to be by making legislative change. So from all the stuff I've heard today, what are the three most important things you can tell me about making legislative change that's going to lead to improved outcomes for women and children? Sorry, that's a difficult question, but that's the lens that I've got to look at all of this stuff through. Thanks.
Thank you very much, MLA O'Reilly. Dr. Moffat.
All right, MLA O'Reilly, yes, I recognize that. We recognize the issue here is it is a very complex problem with multiple issues within the issue. So, and I recognize that there you do need some recommendations. So, of course, one of our top recommendations is about transitional housing, is about this focus on housing that the government has taken, because people, when you think about what we need a roof over our head. We need lots of other things as well, but that's one very important thing for us to be safe and secure. And we've thought about this a lot, and we know that the Liquor Act is open right now, and we know that there is a lot of changes that have been recommended from various reports, and that it is being worked on. So it may be that some of this is going to go hand in hand. That it's even in our whole government approach, it might be that the recommendations from several areas come together to improve the whole. And that's what we were trying to say in terms of prevention. And, I think we've heavily spoken about a paradigm shift in thinking. And, there is this normalization of violence out there. There is a blame and shame still. We need to do some good education. And sometimes I think that education, this doesn't cost money, but I just think that it doesn't get out to the communities. People don't have an opportunity. When we were doing the community engagement meetings, we did them across the territory. And, one community said to me, could you come back next Friday? Could we could we keep doing this like often? Because it's through these forums that the community people get to articulate what they think might help. And, you know, they don't have all the answers, but they certainly have some. So I know there's a complexity with what you're asking us, but I hope I've given you some of our ideas. But I thank you very much for the question. And I think that Ms. Fikowski should actually have an opportunity to share as well in case I have forgotten or not addressed this question fulsomely to give you some specifics.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski.
Thank you, and thank you, MLA O'Reilly. I appreciate the question. It's an intimidating question to try and find answers to. And if the question is specifically looking for recommendations to the Child and Family Services Act, it would move away. I mean, I think there's pieces to what we can do and augment and improve upon with Child and Family Services, but I think we also need to just constantly remind ourselves that we have to think about the other departments and ways in which they can also work and take responsibility to support children and families in this prevention approach. And I think, like what Dr. Purtis was saying with housing for us, that, you know, this weekend we kind of bantered around kind of our wish list with the menu that we have. And I think really having housing for women and families is really, really critical moving forward. Stable housing, having transitional housing programs. There's so many barriers in front of women that are connected to the social determinants that they can't even get out of violence without even looking at some of those basic needs that they have. And sometimes arrears are happening, and all of these pieces where can we not just kind of wipe these arrears and let them get housed? They're in a violent relationship, they need housing. So I think we need to kind of look at all departments and see where they can have responsibility in addressing your question. So housing to me would be a big piece of it, and I agree with what Dr. Moffat referred to in terms of the Liquor Act. And using some incredible research that came out of the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, that they did that report, the CAPE report, very recently, and they had really tangible policy level recommendations to address alcohol and alcohol-related harm. And I think that though I would never suggest that alcohol leads to violence, it certainly is happening, you know, in the same vein as intimate partner violence, family violence issues. So I think that to address alcohol and support people who are using alcohol would be really an effective way to move forward. And then thirdly, I would look at education again, and I've mentioned that previously. So those would kind of be my big three, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions? Emily Johnson.
Thank you for your presentation today, and I guess I will try and frame this as a question, but just something I wanted to point attention to that I appreciate you raising. In your 2017 report, you raise a number of times how we actually fund things, and you know, the kind of short-term year-to-year model of funding that so many of our service providers and our shelters operate on. And I actually found it quite illuminating that even an RCMP officer said they have this problem within the RCMP, and he has this problem, you know, when referring people to services, is that you never quite know if they're going to be there next year. And of all the areas this committee does have power over, I think that is one, is the budget of the GNWT. And we probably have to, you know, make some sacrifices ourselves of giving things longer term funding. It actually means we as MLAs sometimes are giving up some of our accountability, is that we like to review the government's budget every single year and you know, make sure that things are on track. But sometimes that multi-year funding goes a long way. So I thank you for raising that, and I guess to frame it as a bit of a question, Can you perhaps speak to, some of the challenges you see in delivering shelter services, when your funding is in question every year? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA Johnson. Dr. Moffat?
Yes, that is a very good question. And I really do believe that shelters do need long-term and stable funding. They are providing a very effective service across our country. And I know that here in the North, we actually mentioned it in the 2017 report. We do not have enough shelters, safe homes, places for women to go to. And, we've visited all of the shelters. And, there was one time in a shelter, they didn't even have a vacuum cleaner. Like they didn't have the funds to have the tools that they need for women who are living there. And then, of course, along came the pandemic, and I think we needed more communication, more airtime, that the shelters were still open right at the beginning of the pandemic. And, is there a place in our shelters? This is one of the things that we didn't get to today, but if they had more funding, they could maybe hire and have some counseling service provided in the shelter for women and children. Now, that would be a wonderful opportunity for women and children to have some help while they're away, and they would take that with them, those gains and things that they've learned from it. So shelters are a very good thing that you're bringing up, because, we only have the 5 shelters and they're spread out. And of course, our communities are really scattered. And that means that women are always having to travel quite a distance to seek safety. So it's not a matter of getting in your car and driving out of the community either. So they don't have phones. They're on and on and on. We won't go there. But just to say thank you very much for that question, because there needs to be stable funding for shelters, and also could be an improved service within shelters. And I again am going to ask my partner here, Ms. Fikowski, if she could share anything that I've missed there.
Very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski?
Thank you. And thank you so much for the question that's really specific to shelter services and recognizing the importance of stable and adequate funding. And I think that to me is really critical, that there's 2 prongs to this piece. It has to be stable, sustainable, but there needs to be adequate funding that is provided to shelter services, so that it's not just about meeting those basic necessities and barely making that happen. So Dr. Moffat had mentioned we were traveling to one shelter in our first study, and they didn't have a vacuum. And that's just kind of the basic necessities, let alone being able to and have the capacity to provide additional supports and services for these families that are in this crisis and are experiencing trauma, and with hopes of being able to move forward in their lives away from that violent situation. So I think that we need to just make sure that it's not just about kind of keeping them afloat, but looking at providing them enough funding where they can hire staff, appropriately trained staff, have additional programming in-house that can also kind of support women beyond those just basic needs of food and shelter and some clothing for them when they arrive. So thank you very much, because I think it's really about sustainability and the adequacy of what's being provided. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. Emily Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try and sneak one more question in a completely different area here. That's minimum unit pricing for alcohol. I would disagree with some of the other recommendations on limitation of alcohol, but I certainly agree on minimum unit pricing. And actually, the entire pricing of alcohol in the Northwest Territories seems to be lacking any kind of coherent reasoning right now. But if I could just get you to speak to your previous study on, some of the things we have to watch out for on, how to do minimum unit pricing properly, and what you would suggest the territory adopt as that minimum unit price. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, MLA Johnson. Dr. Moffat?
I think I will refer this question to Ms. Fikowski.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Ms. Fikowski?
Hi, thank you very much. Our first study did not really specifically look at legislative recommendations for reducing alcohol-related harm. What it really highlighted, and what we heard constantly from the frontline workers, was a need to address alcohol and alcohol use at not just kind of a frontline level, but it needs to be addressed legislatively. There was a lot of calls from the RCMP looking for support in their efforts as well. So I know that and Dr. Moffat, please feel free to correct me, but if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of what we heard from the RCMP was they really endorsed the notion of small purchase amounts in the Liquor Act. Right now, people can purchase as much as they want, and so that for them was something that really stood out as a way we could kind of move forward legislatively. The report that we reference in this presentation today is not ours, but I really encourage you to review it, and I'm happy to send it to the committee. It is the CAPE report, the Canadian Alcohol Policy Evaluation, and it was completed by out of the University of Victoria. It's a national study that it was kind of like a report card, actually, for every jurisdiction across Canada on these 11 major points that they were marking each jurisdiction on. And so unfortunately, most jurisdictions in Canada received a failing grade throughout their report, and certainly the Northwest Territories were no different in that. And so you could look at kind of the evaluations, and then you can also look at some of the policy level strategies that they are endorsing and recommending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fikowski. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions or comments for either of our presenters today? Seeing none, I just want to take this opportunity to extend a huge thank you from committee for both your time and your expertise in sharing that with us. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having additional conversations with both of you as we progress through this review. So thank you very much for your time today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. We enjoyed being here.
Yes, thank you very much for this.
So much to both of you. At this time, members, can I have a motion to move in camera for committee? Thank you, MLA Simpson, and thank you again to both of our presenters for your time today.